Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 15 of the Listening Room Sonic Journeys. I'm your host, your groove guru, and your guide to the vibes. I am the cultural DJ, and it has been hot these past few days. It's around here where I am. It was like a high of 105 yesterday, so it's very hot, to say the least. So I hope you all are staying hydrated. You all are drinking your water. You all are not drinking a bunch of sugary drinks and saying you're hydrated. Not drinking a bunch of soda or anything like that. Drink water. This is the Cultural DJ PSA saying drink more water. Stay hydrated because it is summer and it is hot and I don't want y'all getting hurt. Anyways, today we are focusing on the topic that I've spent the last few weeks kind of putting together. The week prior I mentioned that I didn't finish this particular topic, or at least get all the notes together the way I wanted to, and I was going to save it for the next episode, which is this episode, the current episode. And today's topic for the Listening Room Sonic Journeys is ZE Records and the birth of Mutant Disco. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe. New episodes out every Thursday. And be sure to follow all of the Cultural DJ social media pages, the Cultural DJ TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. The links for those will be found in the description, along with the Substack for any articles that I publish. And also check out the accompanying playlist for this episode. That will be found in the description as well. So, ZE Records. Why ZE Records? Well, over the last year or so, I have become rather fascinated with this particular record label. And as far as Mutant Disco, I discovered it for the first time a little over a year ago. And since then, I have become completely gobsmacked, completely fascinated and borderline obsessed with Mutant Disco, that whole scene. I mean, I've been interested in, we're talking about kind of the New York underground scene, which I've been interested in for a long time, like the punk scene, the CBGB scene, all of that. But finding Mutant Disco and all of the artists involved and everything has really kind of taken me on a joyride of different bands and different sounds and different aesthetics and everything. And it's been really, really cool and really, really fruitful for my development as a music enjoyer and also as a music historian, because there was a lot going on here. I mean, even outside of just Mutant Disco and ZE Records, there was so much going on in the New York underground scene, in the first wave punk rock scene, in the just all of that going on in New York. New York was such a hotbed for so much talent, so much art, so many amazing things happening even outside of just music. But we're going to focus on ZE Records and Mutant Disco. But before that, I do kind of want to set the scene a little bit to ease us into the main topic. So by 1978, when ZE Records was founded, a handful of bands in the first wave punk scene, like from 1976, and a lot of people that are hanging around CBGB, had already began exploring new musical avenues and infusing kind of a art school sensibility into their music. You find that with bands like Talking Heads, for example, and Television, Richard Hell, all of them, right? Along with that, you had hip-hop, which was emerging in the Bronx. You had disco culture. It was all but dead, but to many in the mainstream. It was pretty much dead to most mainstream people, but, it was still very much alive in the underground. Rock fans hated, and I've spoken about this before in previous episodes, but, rock fans hated disco and disco culture, and they wanted it pretty much gutted completely. But disco culture was pretty much anything but dead for a lot of people that were partaking in that culture, going to clubs like Paradise Garage, for example, and they were using disco as far as the sound basis for what would become Mutant Disco, and we'll get into that later. But you had DJs already kind of infusing different genres during their sets. Like Larry Levan, for example, was known for playing, disco and soul and gospel and electronic music and creating what was then, or what has become known as garage music or garage house. Okay? So they were fusing a lot of genres that didn't necessarily go together, but they made them go together and they sounded fantastic. And you had all these different New York ecosystems bleeding into each other. You had art school students and art appreciators. They were going to punk shows, and you had these punk artists that were playing at places like CBGB, for example, and then going to disco parties on the weekends. And then disco fans might go to a hip hop house party hosted by Kool Herc or Grandmaster Flash. You had DJs, punks, indie filmmakers, poets, painters, experimental artists. They might all be a part of the same social circle, a part of the same orbit. So you had all of this overlap, all of this cross-pollination of these different cultures coming together in the New York underground. That's what I was talking about earlier, is that it was just this really wonderful, really colorful and eclectic scene going on in New York at the time. And that's kind of where Mutant Disco was able to not only be born, but also have room to breathe and grow and foster this community of people that were able to fuse essentially all of it together. Not all of it, I shouldn't say all of it, but a good majority of it. They were able to fuse a good majority of all these different styles and cultures and backgrounds together in music and art to create this new subgenre. And they called it, it was more retrospectively referred to as Mutant Disco and No Wave also. And later, I think it's kind of interchangeable with Avant Funk, I've heard. But personally, I kind of consider Avant Funk to be something a bit different compared to Mutant Disco. I feel that Avant Funk and Mutant Disco kind of have their own separate sounds for the most part, but some people consider them to be interchangeable. So that setup of what was happening in the New York underground will then bring us to the founders of ZE Records, Michael Zilka and Mikel Esteban. So Michael Zilka was an entrepreneur, is an entrepreneur. He's not dead yet. But Michael Zilka is an entrepreneur who was also a contributor to the Village Voice. He worked in New York. He's from Britain. He's from Great Britain. He's English. But he moved to New York and worked in the publishing industry and was contributing to the Village Voice. And then Mikel Esteban is a Frenchman. He's from France, and he had a lot going on, to say the least. He was a record producer, and he was also a bit of an impresario, okay? He spent a lot of time traveling between France and America, specifically New York. He was going to school between both of them for a period of time, or he was going to art school in New York. And during that time, he was able to embrace a lot of that culture that was happening in early to mid 70s New York. He became friends with a lot of the major players of that scene, like Patti Smith and Richard Hell and John Cale, who we'll talk about in a little bit. And he went to CBGB a lot, so it was kind of that exposure to that culture of underground New York that made him want to come back after a period of time. But while he was in Paris in 1975, he opened up his own shop called Harry Cover. And what Harry Cover had was, it basically sold rock merch. That'd be like magazines and books and records, both from the UK and the US. And Harry Cover, the basement would end up becoming a rehearsal space for a lot of up-and-coming Parisian new wave bands. Along with that, he started his own publication, his own magazine called Rock News, which covered the birth and development of the punk rock movement happening in America and in the UK, as well, France, but American punk, British punk, Parisian punk. He was covering it all in this magazine. And he was able to also publish books for Patti Smith and his then girlfriend, Lizzie Mercier Declus, who was also French. Patti Smith, her first books, Wit and The Night, and then Lizzie Mercier Declus' book, I'm going to probably butcher this, but Desiderata. These are poetry books that we're talking about. But he published Patti Smith's and Lizzie Mercier Declus' poetry books along with everything else that he was doing. And in 1977, being a record producer, he would sign the French band Marie et les Garçons, who was a French punk and new wave band, and he would ask John Cale of the Velvet Underground to produce them. And Cale was creating his own record label with Patti Smith's manager and his then girlfriend, John Cale's then girlfriend, Jane Friedman, and he asked Esteban to help out. So with that, you had John Cale, Michael Esteban, and Jane Friedman, and then Cale would actually introduce Esteban to Michael Zilkha, and this would create the record label known as Spy Records. And Spy Records was a short-lived record label, and they would produce and release a handful of singles by artists like Harry Toledo and the Rockets, Lester Bangs, who is actually a journalist and a music critic, but he would also they would also produce Marie et les Garçons, and John Cale would also release a few singles on that label as well. After a short tenure with Spy Records, Zilkha and Esteban would leave Spy Records to start their own label in 1978, which became ZE Records. And the ZE actually comes from the first letters of their last names, Z for Zilkha and E for Esteban, so ZE Records, right? And they began signing and recording talent in and around the New York scene. Many were punk artists, there were disco artists, and there were also some new wave acts as well. And this fusion of styles would later be categorized as Mutant Disco and also no wave, right? And the label would obtain a licensing deal with Island Records through Chris Blackwell, who was the founder of Island Records, and also a friend of Esteban's then girlfriend after he was with Lizzie Mercier Declus. He was with the fashion editor Anna Wintour, who was actually the editor-in-chief for Vogue for nearly 50 years, but I digress. They got a licensing deal with Island, and this licensing deal would allow ZE to have a worldwide level of exposure. So they were getting a lot more well-known outside of just New York. So people from all over the world were getting to hear them now. But ZE Records would sign a litany of artists. A few I can list: Christina, Lydia Lunch, James White and the Blacks, Was Not Was, Lizzie Mercier Declus, Kid Creole and the Coconuts, The Waitresses, Suicide, and even John Cale himself, who would release some records on ZE Records too. Many of the releases were debuted at the aforementioned Paradise Garage Club in New York. And like I said, Paradise Garage was the birthplace of garage, or garage house music. Now, ZE Records, much like Spy, was short-lived. It had a very short tenure of about 4 years. They were founded in 1978, and the success kind of petered off around 1982, especially after Esteban would leave New York in 1982, and as a result, ZE Records would actually close down 2 years later in 1984. But Esteban would still hang around with Lizzie Merced de Clou and would still record other artists. And he would come to actually restart the ZE label in 2003, but in France as opposed to restarting it in New York where it was founded. He brought it to his native France and would sign and record newer artists there instead, and also would reissue older material. And that's pretty much where ZE has been since then, is Esteban having it located in France and going about the business of ZE in that manner. So we've talked about the before and the during of ZE Records. Now let's talk a bit about the after, because why are we really talking about ZE Records and, like the kind of the legacy of this label? This label is not as big as some others are, but the lasting impact is quite profound because ZE Records and Mutant Disco as a genre would really kind of lay the foundation for what would become dance punk. You had a lot of artists back then who were fusing punk and post-punk with dance music and disco, and they were becoming fascinated by the African Afrobeat and Afro-funk records that were being imported over from Africa to America and to the UK. So they were incorporating a lot of those types of music, a lot of music from Central and Southern America, basically employing a whole bunch of different styles into the punk, post-punk, and new wave bass. And this would essentially become the blueprint for what would later become dance punk, which is pretty popular nowadays. A lot of punk bands have adopted a more groove-based, kind of funkier tone and aesthetic. And the work that ZE Records did with their artists like Lizzie Merced de Clou and Was Not Was and Kid Creole and the Coconuts would lay the foundation for that. They were a label that became essentially the hippest label to be on in New York. They were taking a bunch of artists that a lot of other labels were rejecting, like Suicide, for example. Apparently nobody wanted Suicide from what I've read, but ZE Records took them up and they became one of the most prominent bands on that label. These bands that didn't abide by any specific rules, they pretty much did what they wanted. They made the kind of music that they wanted to make. They took the rule book and chucked it out the window, essentially. And ZE Records was the label that fostered a lot of this culture. A lot of these artists that wanted to take those chances, that wanted to say, hey, we can fuse punk rock with disco, and that's perfectly fine. ZE was the label to do that. And if I could pull a quote from the great John Peel in Melody Maker in 1982, he said that ZE Records was the best independent record label in the world. In the world. And this is John Peel, who was the resident host and DJ of BBC Radio 1 for many, many years. So he was listening to all different types of music. In fact, he was kind of the person, I know I'm getting a bit off topic here, but he was somebody that was also embracing a lot of the weirder, more less mainstream types of music. He was putting on reggae bands and metal bands, grindcore, hip-hop, punk, all these different styles of music that weren't mainstream at the time. So it's kind of a dual effort on different fronts. But again, I digress a bit. But that is to show that ZE Records was becoming a much more prominent record label in the eyes of people who appreciated more alternative, more underground, and more DIY music and that whole ethos around it. And finally, I would like to go over a few key releases that I would recommend for listening. Like I said, there will be a accompanying playlist along with this episode, but a few key releases I'd like to go over. Some of these first ones are predominantly compilation records, but they are released by ZE Records themselves. Most of them, not all of them. I think one is not, but the rest of them are. So you have Zetrospective 1, Dancing in the Face of Adversity, and Zetrospective 2, Hope Springs Eternal. These are two compilations released by ZE Records that has a handful of their top artists on them to really get a feel for what ZE was about. That's kind of the point of all of these compilations, really. Then you also have Zevolution number 1, ZE Edits Redux album, and it is essentially what it sounds like. It is an album full of remixes of various ZE Records releases. Then I would also recommend No New York, which is not a ZE Records release, but No Wave. This is a No Wave compilation. It was compiled by Brian Eno and released on Antilles Records in 1978, which is when, of course, ZE Records was founded. But it documents the no wave scene in New York at the time, and I feel like it is essential listening if you want to get a fuller idea of what ZE Records was about, because they also employed some no wave bands as well. So I would recommend No New York to you as well. There is Mutant Disco Volumes 1 through 4. Volume 1, 2, and 4 are called A Subtle Dislocation of the Norm. Volumes 1 and 2 are kind of like Zetrospectives 1 and 2 that I mentioned earlier. And Volume 4 is also, I believe, remixes as well. But Volume 3 is called Garage Sale. So if you can find these on streaming or get your hands on them in any way, I'd recommend Mutant Disco Volumes 1 through 4. I do believe Volumes 1, 2, and 4, you can find playlists of them on Spotify, so I check those out. And then finally for the compilations, I'd recommend New York Noise, which is a release by the great people at Soul Jazz Records, very much like the other compilations. It is a archival release of different bands that were signed to ZE Records, but it's really just kind of a glimpse into the mutant disco and no wave scenes happening in New York. Now for the actual ZE Records releases that are not compilations, the first one I recommend is Mambo Nassau by Lizzie Mercier de Clou. This is probably my favorite release on ZE Records, and Lizzie Mercier de Clou is one of my favorite artists from ZE Records. It is so funky. It's so cool. Lizzie Mercier de Clou actually traveled to the Bahamas to record this album and really embrace kind of the culture of that particular area. And I'd also recommend her first album as well, which is Press Color. I would recommend Press Color as well, but Mambo Nassau is really where it's at if you want a better idea of just how funky and eclectic Lizzie Mercier de Clou can be. I'd recommend Was Not Was's self-titled album. I would recommend Wise Guy by Kid Creole and the Coconuts. The song on there called I'm Corrupt is one that I've been absolutely obsessed with for the past maybe year and a half, 2 years. When I found it, I could not stop listening. I think it was my most listened to song last year, no joke. I'm Corrupt is a fantastic track, but the whole album is great too. So Wise Guy by Kid Creole and the Coconuts. I would recommend Christina's self-titled album as well. I would recommend Rebop EP, and also that this is by the band I mentioned before, Marie Ele Garçon, Rebop EP, and also 1977/1979, which is a compilation album of songs they released between those 2 years. And then finally, I'll recommend Suicide, Alan Vega, and Martin Rev. This is their second album, and from what I understand, their only release on ZE Records, but it gives you a really good idea of what the band Suicide was about. Kind of the more art punk, dancey electronic sounds, the more disco-influenced sounds that was really kind of synonymous with ZE Records. And yeah, I would recommend those to you. those 6 records plus the aforementioned compilation albums. And with all that being said, I will leave you all off with that. Thank you all so much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. This took a good bit of research and note writing, so hopefully it all kind of came together in a solid way for you all. But yeah, again, if you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. New episodes out every Thursday. Be sure to follow the Cultural DJ socials, the Cultural DJ TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. The links for those will be in the description, along with the Substack that will be found in the description and the accompanying playlist for further listening. The link for that will also be in the description as well. Thank you all again, and I will see you all next time. This is the Cultural DJ signing off.